Hello, welcome to the Book Gallery, a series of conversations with writers and scholars of imagination and erudition. I'm your host, Luke Sheehan, editor of the University Bookman. Founded by Russell Kirk, the University Bookman redeems the time by identifying and discussing books that diagnose the modern age and support a renewal of culture and the common good. We are at the end of September and nearing October, or as we at the Kirk Center like to call it, Kirktober, the month of Russell Kirk's birth. Over the next month, the Kirk Center is running a fundraising campaign in honor of the Bookman's founder. You can find out more information at kirkcenter.org/bookman/Kirktober. Related to our topic today, the Kirk Center is offering a course titled The Moral Imagination of Jane Austen, taught by Hillsdale professor Lita Sundet this November and December. Check that out in the link in the chat. Cultural conservatives appreciate the importance of a literary canon. And surely it can be said that conservatives have their own. There you will find the likes of C.S. Lewis, John Ronald Reuel Tolkien, and G.K. Chesterton. But what might we be missing? Are there other authors and novels that we ought to read but haven't? Christopher Scalia gives us a resounding yes to this question. Conservatives have missed what ought to be some conservative classics. And 13 novels conservatives will love but probably haven't read, Scalia names a baker's dozen that should make your reading list, but probably hasn't. These are books that will enliven the imagination and maybe even lift up the heart, exploring conservative themes with penetrating depth as only literature can. Dr. Christopher Scalia is a senior fellow in the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies Department at the American Enterprise Institute, where he focuses on literature, culture, and higher education. Dr. Scalia is the co-editor of On Faith, Lessons from an American Believer, and Scalia Speaks, Reflections on Law, Faith, and a Life Well Lived. Dr. Scalia, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Luke. It's great to talk to you tonight.
So let's talk about the premise of this book. So we have a conservative canon. I think it's fair to say we've all read Tolkien. Many of us have read the Silmarillion and the background. We've all read Lewis, and of course the classics that are in there. But you came up with this book idea. Walk us through it. What is this?
Well, as you said, there is something like a conservative canon, books that most conservatives have read. And when you talk to conservatives about novels they love, we tend to talk about the same handful, the ones you mentioned, and then maybe Brideshead Revisited by Waugh, probably something by Jane Austen. There's probably a Dostoevsky in there, Bonfire of the Vanities, Ayn Rand. And most of those are great, and we should continue to read those. But we've kind of I think we limit ourselves a little bit because we always talk about those. Those are the ones we go back to again and again. And I'm basically trying to expand the conservative bookshelf. There's nothing wrong. I want people to continue reading those books, but by limiting ourselves to that handful, I think we're selling ourselves short, or we're just overlooking great elements of a conservative literary tradition. So I'm trying to expand that bookshelf by introducing readers to 13 great novels that I think anybody will love. I think you don't have to be conservative to recognize that these are great novels because they are of extraordinary literary merit. But conservatives in particular will be drawn to them because they address conservative themes or ideas that are of particular interest to conservatives in thoughtful and compelling ways. I should add that I focus on English language original novels only, just to make my life a little bit easier over the course of that project. But I go from 1759 to 2020, so I try to get a pretty good range, chronologically speaking, in the novels I cover.
And the novels you pick too, this is not 13 sci-fi novels that the conservatives should read.
That is correct. I focus on literary fiction. I'm a little bit snobbish about it. I think literary fiction that is grounded. Most of these novels, not all of them, most of them are grounded in everyday realities. Because I think that's the way, that's the genre that is most capable of helping us gain insights from how people think and psychological complexity and compelling, incredible characters. But more importantly, that's just the fiction I know best. I don't mean to say nobody should read sci-fi or crime fiction or anything like that, because I know that a lot of that is good stuff. But my own background, what I focus on and what I enjoy the most is literary fiction. And that's really what I'm trying to push people towards.
There's an interesting question of if there's something inherent in genres.
Hmm.
So some people have suggested that, uh, religion is kind of especially expressed through like high fantasy. Can really
Yes.
explore some of those themes. Sci-fi, I think that maybe libertarians can
Yeah.
can explore themes there, and so on.
No, that's a good point. And P.D. James, I write about. She's a great crime novelist. I include her dystopian novel, "Children of Men," in my book, and she said that there's something distinctively conservative about crime fiction, or at least a mystery novel, because it moves from disorder to the restoration of order over the course of that novel, or at least how she envisioned the genre. But that's true. There are great, I think, was it Harrison Bergeron, the Philip K. Dick short story is a
Right.
wonderful um, uh, consideration of DEI gone mad in a way. Though I don't think the author would have really considered himself a conservative. There's something to be said for sci-fi novels in that vein too. I
Right.
think that's the right novelist.
Right. And Kirk, of course, liked writing ghost stories.
Yes, absolutely. The Gothic. Yeah, I mean, traditionally speaking, a lot of the great Gothic novelists were conservative. Or at least the Gothic is very good at exploring conservative um, considerations of the past, the how
Right.
the past is inescapable. The first um, Gothic novel is The Castle of Otranto by Walpole, and there's certainly some conservative elements there. The Prime Minister's Son. Um, uh, but then with all these genres, they're not limited, obviously, to just conservatism. There's the radical philosopher, political philosopher William Godwin, Romantic era thinker, um, wrote a great rebuttal to Edmund Burke's reflections on the Revolution in France, called Caleb Williams, not to be confused with the Chicago Bears quarterback. We're predating him by a couple hundred years. That's a wonderful, as I said, response to Edmund Burke, and it takes on the form of a Gothic, but it's certainly not a conservative novel.
A little bit more on the novel.
Mhm.
Lionel Trilling says that the novel is the most effective agent of moral imagination. And this is kind of interesting because the novel's relatively new. We had epic poems for a long
Yeah.
time, but the novel, talk a little bit about the novel as a art form.
Yeah, you're right. The novel it's really still kind of a novel art form. I mean, it seems like it's been around forever, but it hasn't. It's really only a few hundred years, quote unquote, only a few hundred years old. But in the context of just the Western tradition, that's relatively new. But what makes the novel such a potent form of the uh, mode in which to explore the moral imagination is that it is open to psychological complexity and psychological depth in ways that other literary forms were not. Um, I don't think it's a coincidence that the novel really developed in Britain during the 18th century, when at the same time a lot of philosophers like Hume and Adam Smith, in particular, were really interested in theories of sympathy and the sympathetic imagination. How is it that we feel um, drawn to the strong emotions of other people? Why do we react as we do to the sorrows and pains of others? And then the novel is really, I think, born out of that same imaginative exercise to see how we can feel for other people. And there was a whole subgenre of the novel in the 18th century called sentimental fiction, which was just basically, it can be hard to read now because characters respond so strongly to the pain and suffering of others. It's over the top, but that was a sign of just how well bred those characters were. The more strongly reacted to the experiences of others, the more refined you were. Now we don't go that far anymore, but I still think that, well, to this day, most defenders of fiction will at least give a passing glance at the argument that fiction is an important way for us to help develop our sympathetic abilities. And that doesn't mean we feel exactly what the characters we're reading about are feeling, but it means that we're able to a degree, put ourselves in the shoes and the experiences of other people. I should say not all great novels do that. I don't think satires do that. And I don't think that the novel's emphasis on showing us the lives of other people means that we necessarily have to approve of those lives. But the ability to try to understand different ways people live and think and different things they believe is an important exercise. And I would argue, especially in a democracy, that's a very important skill to develop.
Let's talk just kind of, I think everyone on here understands the definition of conservatism, but how are you defining the term?
Yeah. Well, I focus on a handful of central tenets that conservatives have held over the course of centuries, and more modestly over the course of, say, the last 60 years. And I should say, speaking to a group of Russell Kirk aficionados, in my introduction, I pay homage to his great collection, A Portable Conservative, which I encountered at a bookstore in Madison, Wisconsin, and I had heard of Kirk. My father had long praised the conservative mind to me, but I hadn't seen this anthology. And one of the things I loved about the anthology was that it included works of fiction. Nathaniel Hawthorne's great fable, Earth's Holocaust, is in there, and I discussed that a little bit in my book. And then great works of poetry as well. And I thought that was a really potent reminder that literature can subtly explore values of particular importance and significance to conservatives. But what I try to do is look at conservative themes and ideas, such a different one or two in each chapter. So in my first chapter, I write about Samuel Johnson's story, Rasselas, Prince of Abyssinia. And what I argue about that work is that Johnson is emphasizing the existence of an enduring and universal human nature. That is, not that everybody is the same everywhere and that there aren't differences between cultures, but that there are certain ambitions and passions and ways of behaving and ways of reacting that endure across time and space. And that is an important value for conservatives, for American conservatives in particular, because it kind of underscores the entire premise of our founding. And though Samuel Johnson was not a fan of the American Revolution, in Rasselas, some of his expressions and outside of Rasselas as well, in some of his essays, I quote, you see some definite echoes or foreshadowing of some of the language of our founders. And the belief in a universal human nature is important to conservatives because it necessarily puts a check on the power of what a government can do. And so that takes me to another kind of central conservative principle, which is a limited government. Not anarchy, obviously, but a government that has just certain limited and restricted powers. If you believe human nature is malleable, well, who's going to shape human nature? The government. But if human nature is constant and more or less unchangeable, then we know better than to think that some sort of Marxist revolution, for example, is going to be able to change the very essence of human ambitions and desires. So every chapter I go through different conservative principles like that. I discuss the importance of religious faith for conservatism. That was something, obviously, that was very important to Kirk. And I discuss in another novel, My Antonia by Willa Cather, I discuss what we might call the American dream. and the importance of resilience in achieving that independence and success in the United States. And in a couple of novels, I look at the dangers of revolutionary thought and revolutionary thinking. A Bend in the River by V.S. Naipaul is one of them. Waverly by Walter Scott. Russell Kirk's favorite novelist, by the way. I quote Russell Kirk a couple times in that chapter. Also, elevated incremental change over sudden and drastic change.
And one more thing, I think the importance of the imagination.
Mhm.
And so we'll get into this. I want to talk about a few of the novels you pick out. Same with Johnson. I think is your earliest one,
It is, yeah,
chronologically.
1759.
And just tell us a little bit about that one, because I actually got surprised. I was just assumed I was going to be, late 19th into the 20th century. So give us this first one.
Well, there's a caveat here because Rassless is technically not a novel. It's something called an Oriental tale, but it's a kind of a long fictional narrative. I thought it was close enough. But we're still kind of in the early decades of the novel in Britain. And Johnson in some of his essays, he was a great essayist. And in one of his essays in particular, he was worried about what the new form of the novel, how it could influence young readers or impressionable readers, because he thought that was the main audience of novels. Mostly that was who was reading this new form. So he emphasized that this new kind of fiction really needed to elevate virtue and moral goodness. And while Rassless is technically not a novel, you can see him kind of working out that theory in practice in Rassless. The title character is a very privileged prince of Abyssinia, which we now call Ethiopia, and he leads a sheltered life, has everything handed to him, but there's no room for ambition where he is. Life is too easy. And what we learn early on is that life without some sort of desire, some sort of goal, is shallow and unsatisfying. So he meets a wise poet in this in this refuge of this pseudo paradise, who tells him about the outside world. And so Rassless and a couple of companions decide to venture out into that world, guided by this wise poet. And again, they run into people who have ambitions and dreams that are sometimes disappointed, but more often realized. And then at that moment of realization, disappointment arises. So there's this sense that it's just inherent in human nature that you should want something, you should have a purpose, you should find a purpose. But when you realize that purpose, you will be disappointed. And it's in some ways it sounds like a pessimistic novel, or message or moral, but really that should strengthen us, because we recognize that it is not bad to desire something, but we need to recognize that it's just part of human nature to, once you achieve that thing, to never think you will suddenly find peace and contentment. Most people do not, even after they realize some goal. It doesn't mean the goal was not worthwhile, but it's just that's not the end of your ambition. And there are also kind of funny encounters with very bizarre people. One is an astronomer who becomes so obsessed with his goal and his pursuit in astronomy that his mind becomes addled, and he thinks he is actually able to affect the climate, and actually affect what goes on in the world through his study. This is an important, I think, warning to becoming too focused on a single pursuit and so wrapped up and insulated in your own world that you lose touch with reality. So over the course of the travels, the young Rassless and his companions learn important lessons like this. And what's fascinating about the novel is that, it's fictional, but it aspires to this sort of empirical status where people travel from place to place and are getting what we now call these data points from everywhere. The characters they're technically African, um, but Johnson is implying to his European readers in the 18th century, you should be learning from these Africans. And I think that's, I don't know if it may be too much to say that that's a radical move, but that in and of itself is suggesting the universality of the human nature.
Right. And a couple of these books aim at manners and
Yes.
their importance. Evelina does.
Yeah.
Is it I forget which one you have. Where is it? I forget if it's Daniel Deronda or
I think
the
Waverly touches on manners a little
Waverly.
bit too. But yeah, I think Evelina by Francis Burney is the one that focuses the most on manners. Just by way of background, I don't include any Jane Austen in this book because I don't think anybody else, nobody needs to tell you to read more Jane Austen. You should read Jane Austen. I kind of take that as a given. But I think people don't read the writers who influenced Jane Austen, and including people Austen mentions in some of her novels and that some of her characters loved reading. And Frances Burney is one of those. Evelina was published, I believe, in 1779, and it's the story about a young woman's entry, a sheltered young woman's entry into the wider world. And she, as I said, was sheltered. She was raised by a vicar, and really had no exposure to the world around her. She is suddenly thrown into the wider world and encounters a lot of rude people, a lot of high class people with very specific sets of manners and customs. And one of the challenges Evelina faces is how to navigate these customs and these manners. And along the way, she has to, rebuff the advances of rude men. She has to endure the very poor manners of relations and things like that. But it's a remarkable novel, not because my point in this chapter is not that we should emulate the manners of the 18th century aristocratic England. We wouldn't want to do that. But I think that the novel is an important reminder that manners do matter, and because they suggest something about our relationship with other people. Minding manners is a way of recognizing the significance of a particular occasion, and of demonstrating respect to the people around you. In that chapter, I make I think somewhat silly but still useful comparison of Evelina and even Austen's novels to shows like Curb Your Enthusiasm with Larry David or Seinfeld, because those are at the core. Those are shows about manners. Larry David, for example, is always freaking out when somebody does not understand the unwritten rules of how many samples you can take in an ice cream line, for example. Now, we don't get that mundane in something like Evelina, but I think we respond to these 18th century and early 19th century novels of manners because we recognize that these things are important. I quote Roger Scruton a couple of times in that chapter because one of the points Scruton makes is that manners are really kind of reflections of what a culture and a society hold dear. And when we lose those, we don't fall into a state of anarchy, but we're losing something significant, and we're blinding ourselves to the things that matter to us.
I want to talk a little bit more about Waverly, because Sir Walter Scott, very famous, and Professor Kirk, we know, loved him. And I've read Ivanhoe, but I had not actually read Waverly. But let's talk about specifically the miseducation of Edward Waverly.
Wonderful. Well, I'm always happy to talk about Walter Scott. I think Walter Scott used to be the most widely read novelist in Europe. Even when that was no longer the case, still everybody read him up until maybe about 50 years ago. The United States, really around the world, but including the United States, places everywhere are named after characters from his novels or novel titles. There's in Virginia alone, there's an Ivanhoe and there's a Waverly. There's an Ivanhoe in Michigan. There's an Ivanhoe in Illinois that I just learned about. So that just gives you, that doesn't mean you have to like him, but it shows that he was very widely read and influential for a long time. Waverly was his first novel. It was published in 1814. Before that, he had been a very popular and successful poet. And Waverly is, well, one of the reasons Scott is less read now is that he wrote historical fiction. So this novel was published in 1814, but it was set in 1745. And much of it is set in the Highlands of Scotland. It depicts the Jacobite uprising of 1745 when the members of the Stuart dynasty tried to reclaim the throne from the Hanoverians after they had been deposed for a couple of generations. Edward Waverley is the main character of this novel. Really, the first three novels I write about, Rasselas, Evelina, and Waverley, are all about young men and women finding their footing in the world. And Waverley is a well-off young man who, but he's poorly educated. And even his name, Waverley, suggests something wavering about him. And that's in large part because of his education. He is sheltered, but, and he has tutors, but his tutors and his father and his uncle, who spends a lot of time raising him, they fail to really give him a directed education, and they let him read whatever he wants to read. Their thinking is the mere scanning of lines on a page is good in and of itself. It doesn't matter really what you're reading. And we hear this today, like, well, at least he's reading. If a kid's reading a graphic novel or something like that, reading is reading. It doesn't matter. But in fact, reading does matter, or the content of what you're reading matters. And because Edward Waverley did not have a really, there was no strategy behind what he read, there was no direction, he becomes easy prey to people smarter than him, and specifically figures who are behind the Jacobite uprising. They basically bring him into their cause. They flatter him. They know what he liked to read, and they appeal to him based on those values. And because he's so naive, he falls for their trap and becomes a supporter of this rebellion. It's funny, Waverley is there are a lot of important books from the Romantic period that are about the necessity of reading well, being careful with what you read. Novelists loved celebrating the novel, but they were always a little bit aware of the bad roads it could lead you down. I mean, Don Quixote, we're talking about a different time period here, but that's certainly one of them. Northanger Abbey by Jane Austen, and even Frankenstein. All of these works are about the dangers of sloppy, unguided reading. Fortunately, Waverley is able to eventually shake out of his delusions and turn things around, but only through a lot of good luck and fortunate connections.
Yeah. So the question of the imagination, I think, is important. So it's which novels you read will actually affect you quite a bit,
Yes.
and how you see the world.
If I can just expand on that, I mean,
Yeah.
we still see that today. I was reading something in the Wall Street Journal this spring about this new genre called romantasy.
Oh yeah.
If anybody who's been in a bookstore has encountered these novels, Sarah Moss is the big novelist, and all of her titles are like A Court of Thorn and Roses and a something of this or that. They're all very iambic and Greek sounding. But from what I understand, all these novels are about elfin realms. So, I mean, it sounds like Tolkien there, but also there's a ton of sex in these novels. And in the Wall Street Journal article explains that many women love these novels because they show them a level of relationship and sexual fulfillment that they're not encountering in their real lives. And the journalist interviewed a therapist who said, yes, a lot of my patients read these books, and I've had to tell some of them, or I've noticed that a lot of them have really distorted views of relationships and what the kind of men they should look for, because they're expecting to encounter characters from these books, even though the books are about elves. Now, of course, any Lord of the Rings fan should acknowledge that one of the reasons we like Lord of the Rings is because we see virtues and values we want to emulate from non-human characters. Um, but I think it's still hilarious that these and a little bit scary that these novels are having this effect on people. But it is very much like what Jane Austen writes about in Northanger Abbey in particular.
That's right. Yeah, that's a very good book.
Yes.
You know, I was thinking of the effect of the imagination. I think conservatives have struggled of late to really understand this. So, you know, that's why we get the, you know, here's why you should get married, and we'll see a graph of like happiness and income or something like that. But not realizing we lost the imaginative battle.
Yeah.
So in the imagination, many young people do not see it as desirable. It doesn't matter how many graphs you show them.
Yes.
We need to show them images of why it's desirable. And that's where we utterly lost in the last half.
No, I think that's right. One of the reasons I love My Antonia by Willa Cather is it celebrates a woman's decision to have a big family. Willa Cather herself did not have a big family, but Antonia, the central character of this novel, an immigrant who encounters a lot of difficulties early in her time in America, eventually finds happiness in a domestic life with many kids. And you just don't, I bring that up because you don't really find many portrayals of big, happy families. And coming from a big family myself and somebody who really loved growing up in a big family, I was drawn to My Antonia for that reason. More broadly speaking, you know, I used to work at a right of center PR firm, and something I heard pretty often in that job, and I've heard from journalists too, is that the right is just bad at telling stories. Conservatives are bad storytellers. And I don't think there's any inherent reason for that, except that I think, well, you know, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on his name. Ben Shapiro, sorry. Ben Shapiro's expression, facts don't care about your feelings. That's, I think that's a great point. But the problem with it is it emphasizes fact over everything else. Storytelling, fictional storytelling can be powerful, and feelings do actually matter. They don't necessarily trump facts, but winning, you can't always win over, you can't assume that you can win people over, persuade people by appealing only to their intellect. You need to appeal to emotions as well. You need to show the connection between emotional resonance and intellectual sanity. And stories are especially good at doing that. I think conservatives blanch at the idea of telling good stories because that seems liberal. It seems too mushy or emotional. But that's only because we've let it become that way. There is storytelling and appeals to the imagination. There's nothing inherently progressive about that. There have been many great conservative storytellers. I write about 13 of them in my book. And I think we need to remember that. And not just for, well, if I tell a story about a job interview I had. I was I was interviewing to be a speechwriter, and one of the questions I was asked was, "What is my favorite story?" And that was a great question. This was a Senate speechwriting position, and that was a great question because it showed that this office understood to persuade voters, to connect with voters, you had to tell stories. You had to connect emotion and heart to reason and the mind, and storytelling is a powerful way of doing that.
And it can show, yeah, I mean, well, Cather's a great example of it. Shows, imagine what it would be like and how good it would be if you chose a large family. You can depict the desirability of that.
Right. And without suggesting that it's easy, or even in Cather's case, My Antonia has examples of other immigrant women, Antonia's peers, who find great happiness without families or husbands and as successful businesswomen. So Cather doesn't beat you over the head with it. But it's clear that she's celebrating that as an option.
Right. And somewhat related to that, we could talk a little bit more about P.D. James, The Children of Men.
Yes, good, nice segue. Yeah.
Lots of people, it's very much portrayed as desirable to be childless. And
Yes.
she's playing off of, and what if we actually got that wish?
Yeah. Yeah, just some background. Everybody loves dystopias, and conservatives and liberals alike. 1984 by Orwell, Brave New World by Huxley, and of course, progressives love Handmaid's Tale. Ross Douthat, among others, likes to contrast Handmaid's Tale with Children of Men by P.D. James, published, I think, in 1992. James imagines a not too distant past or future, which is now it was set in the early 2020s, I believe. So we've passed that setting, but it was about 30 years in the future from when she was writing. And in this world, people have been sterile for a couple of decades, and nobody can really figure out why. But at the beginning of the novel, the youngest person in the world dies, a really futile, stupid death, dies basically in a bar fight. And that shocks everybody. And it's just a reminder of the fact that the human race is more or less doomed. And James was inspired to write the novel because she saw the decline in birth rates. And this was in the early 90s. Things have gotten much, much worse. And what James imagines is a world where there are no more young people. What that does to hope, what that does to our visions of the future. She basically imagines a future without a future. And I think one of the fascinating things about the novel is that she is really interested in what people who don't have children want from their government. If your race is dying out, James suggests all you're really going to want is security and safety. You're not going back to Johnson and ambition. You're not going to have any ambition. There's not as much to work for anymore. And so you want the government to give you things. And as a result, you're more willing to embrace or accept a totalitarian government. The government, meanwhile, needs to save money, needs to be efficient. And one of the things it does to that end in A Brave New World is promote, encourage, and sometimes force euthanasia. And there's a really disturbing scene in the novel in which the main character witnesses a ritual, a euthanistic, I don't know if euthanistic is a word, I'm using it now, a euthanistic ritual where the government basically drowns a number of senior citizens, drugs them, and then drowns them. Now, governments are not doing literally that, but if you look in Canada and see what's happening with the MAID program there, medically assisted, I can't remember what MAID stands for, but it's really gruesome. It's such a pleasant sounding acronym, MAID, but it's a euthanasia program, and the numbers are staggering. What's going on in Canada, and we're seeing it in the UK with the possibility of Parliament passing a bill for basically opening up euthanasia there. James was disturbingly prophetic. I would also recommend this novel to people who like Lord of the Rings. There's a very interesting moment towards the end of the novel where there's a ring that's important to the novel, and it's a symbol of governmental power. And a character who is fighting government power briefly holds on to the ring and then starts thinking of all the power he could have if he were in charge, how much better things would be if he could have the ring. There's a very Lord of the Rings moment there.
And I want to talk about a couple more, and we can take some questions from the audience. But Lee Fingers, Peace Like a River, it's a great book. And I think
It's a great book.
it's something about this is a great where the imagination is. What if we had a family, went through all the things the family go, we got the rebellious teenager who does something
Mhm.
terrible, as they often do, and rascally children, and you had a godly good man as a father. Go. What would happen? That seems
Yeah,
like that was the premise for that one.
yeah, and not just a godly good father, but a father um, who the narrator and son believes can work miracles, and it's uh, a profound novel about faith. If I can back up just for a second, I wanted to be sure I included two novels from this century, um, just to make clear that there is still great literature being written, and conservatives tend to want to focus, grumble that that's not the case. There actually is still a lot of good stuff out there. Peace Like a River is I think, a pretty obscure novel, but I've never met anybody who's read it who didn't love it. Um, when it came out, it was published on September 11th, 2001, an auspicious day for publication. But I had a few members of my family read it when it was first published, and they all told me to read it. I never got around to it. And then I had a colleague once who raved about it, and I still never read it. And I finally got around to reading it when I was working on this book. And boy, I felt like such a dope for not having read it before. It really is just a fantastic novel. Um, yeah, it celebrates family, and it doesn't suggest that the family in this case is perfect, but this family, it's Jeremiah the father, and then two sons and a daughter. The older son is basically a fugitive; he's on the run, and the other members go out to track him down. So that alone kind of recognizes the importance of family. Um, but because the narrator thinks his father can perform miracles, um, and it and to convey those miracles, there's they're kind of Enger incorporates this literary genre called magical realism, and but I call what he does miraculous realism. In magical realism, especially in Latin American novels, in the mid 20th century or so, you had fantastic occurrences happen in everyday life. Um, and but they weren't necessarily in a Christian context. What Enger's doing is he's bringing these miraculous events in a Christian context occurring in the 1960s, and it really forces a Christian to consider the validity of present the possibility, or really the the certainty of miracles continuing today. They can't be limited to the past. Um, and and it imagines a central character who is certain that his father can perform these miracles, but also understands why the people around him, including his siblings, don't don't believe him. And so he has to kind of navigate how to the certainty of his own faith without um, beating it over the head and twisting the arms of other people to see that as well. Another reason I love this novel and included it in this book is because there's so much talk. There has been a lot of talk in the last few years in particular, but for a long time now about masculinity. And the term toxic masculinity has been thrown around a lot over the past decade or so. And this novel presents different versions um, of masculine behavior. The central character, Jeremiah Land, he's the godly character, and he is gentle, he is loving, he is merciful, but there's also he can also be violent when necessary. There's a scene where he kicks some bad guys' butts, and it kind of you think of Jesus in the temple, um, throwing over the money changing tables. Um, so there's this sense that this ideal vision of manhood balances righteous anger and occasionally maybe even violence, with and justice, with love and recognition of rightful authority and the law. His son, on the other hand, his older son, is the fugitive, and he resists higher authority, including religion, but especially the law. And he is excessively violent. His father knows when violence should end and turn towards legal legal means of justice, and his older son does not recognize that. But then there's an even more sinister character who recognizes no higher power, recognizes nothing beyond himself. He's incredibly abusive to innocent, including young women, and he's the ultimate villain of the novel. But we get without beating you over the head with it. What Enger does is establish these three models of masculine behavior, where Jeremiah Land, the most Christian and the most Christ-like character, is also the strongest model of masculine behavior.
And we have a question. This is from Daniel Kopti. Is there a particular foreign language novel in English language translation that you were tempted to add to the list?
Yes. Was it The Betrothed by I'm embarrassingly gonna blank on the name. Is it Manzoni or Manzini? I think Manzoni. A great 19th century Italian novel. I read it many years ago, and it would have been perfect for this book had it originally been written in English. Of course, Brothers Karamazov, though I don't think anybody needs to be told to read that. It's obviously pretty well known. And there Submission by Wilbach, Michel Wilbach, the French novelist. That novel, I think, was published in the 2010s. I can't remember precisely what year. That's a very kind of disturbing vision of the Islamification of Europe. And those are a few that I had considered, and the reason I didn't, as I said before, my specialty, most of my expertise is in the British novel and the novel in English, and that would have been a whole other bag. Not that I want to discourage people from reading those things, but there's also just the problem of which translation. There are all sorts of controversies, especially with Russian novels. About you should read Gary Saul Morson about the popular translations of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky now. I thought that was just knowing the language was the original language of the author and not the translation was appealing to me. One of the reasons I wanted to focus on English language originals.
I wanted to get to one more theme before we take some more questions. Victim.
Yes. Well, I think that's victimhood is bad.
Yeah.
Specifically, to put it in the Christian context, or the conservative context. There are in a couple of novels. I look at depictions of really rejections of victimhood culture. I think the best example of that is Zora Neale Hurston's "Their Eyes Were Watching God," which I don't know about coincidentally. So it's surprising, I think, to a lot of people that I included it in this book, because a lot of people have read that novel. It's people, especially under 40, have had it assigned to them in multiple classes. People over 50 are less likely to have encountered it because it was only really recognized as a great work of fiction in the late 70s and the early 80s, and on to today. But Zora Neale Hurston, the author, even people who've read this novel don't realize that she was a pretty adamant conservative. She hated communism. She voted Republican. She hated the NAACP, even though she was writing a lot of this stuff. She wrote this novel in the 1930s, but she was writing against the NAACP in the 1940s and the 1950s. And she loved Booker T. Washington. She loved Washington's message of self-reliance, of education and practical skills. And Their Eyes Were Watching God is very much about that. The central character, Janie Crawford, does not let herself, fall into traps of or attitudes of despondency. The best characters, and even some seriously flawed characters, are still admirable, because they recognize their ability, even in a Jim Crow South, to build their own lives. There's one character, is a mayor of an all-black community, kind of community that Hurston herself was born in, that builds this all-black community to show what, which is indicative of what this community is capable of, despite all of the odds against them. This is not to say the novel celebrates Jim Crow. It doesn't do that. It recognizes the racism of the time. There are a number of scenes in which there are hints at just how unjust the society was, but Hurston's characters and Hurston herself never focus on that. They always focus on their own resilience and abilities and independence. And then another novel I write about, and that's along the same lines, is V.S. Naipaul's 1979 novel, A Bend in the River. And that's kind of in large part, that novel is a response to post-colonial theories, about how anything in as colonized societies as colonial powers are withdrawing from the colony states, their colonies, and these colonies become independent states. Naipaul is criticizing the idea that these cultures should be rid of all things Western. If it's Western, it's necessarily bad, because Westerners and all their ideas are oppressive. It pushes back against those ideas. It pushes back against the oppressor and oppressed dichotomy that's so in vogue today and in post-colonial studies and in Marxism. And its central character, Salim, is a very flawed individual, but he has a trait that's worth celebrating, which is that he recognizes, he does not let himself become a victim of these post-colonial ideas and the radical ideas of the time.
And there's a great scene in that book where one of the characters, I can't remember, it's Salim, becomes abusive, but the way it's described is like, he beats a woman's face and then she lets herself fall back.
Yeah.
Like he didn't do it to her, it just happened.
Yeah. By the way, if I can go back and correct, The Betrothed was written by Manzoni. That's the Italian author. And Walter Scott also has a novel called The Betrothed, but Manzoni's is better. No, that scene you're describing is easily the most disturbing scene of any scene in any of the novels I write about. It's a scene of sexual violence, and Salim beats his lover, who's a married woman, and he blames her for basically making him do it. And when he describes the beating, he describes it in the passive voice, to basically absolve himself of responsibility, and implies that he's a victim of the actions himself. And what I say about that scene is that it's a rare instance in which he falls into that victimization trap. He's painting himself as a victim here. She made me do it, and he's not just a victim, but he's relinquishing his agency here. And for the rest of the novel, he doesn't do that. For the rest of the novel, he is his own agent, and he is an actor in his own life. But in this one of the reasons the scene is disturbing for all sorts of reasons, but the most subtle reason it's disturbing is because it's his relinquishing of that agency.
We have a question here from Richard Jordan. He says, as you worked on the book, did you notice any novels that are ordinarily considered must-reads for conservatives that, in fact, you would say are not essential for conservatives and perhaps even are books they should avoid?
Well, I think, let me put it this way. There are a lot of novels a lot of conservatives I like and whose opinions I respect. I just don't like as much as a lot of conservatives do. Cormac McCarthy is one example. Conservatives like him because of his well, there's something biblical about his stories and about his writing, um, and his writing style. And they praise his recognition about kind of the fallenness of human nature. I think uh, his novels, I don't like his style very much, and um, I've been told I'm wrong about this by people who know him well, but I just don't find I he gets the flaws in human nature, but too seldom does he recognize the possibility of redemption in human nature. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to include Enger. Enger stylistically in Peace Like a River is he's much more traditional, much more accessible than McCarthy. He's never going to be elevated for the same style as a great stylist in the same way as McCarthy. But Enger, I think, has a lot surprising similarities with McCarthy because it's kind of writing neo-Western in some ways. We get cowboys, we get people on horseback and things you would expect from a McCarthy novel. And we get these very sinister, evil characters, but we have more of a sense of hope and a specifically Christian context that McCarthy doesn't offer very often. Walker Percy is another writer that a lot of conservatives love. I do not love him. I like the movie Goer, but I don't love it, and I reread it again in preparation for this book, and was confirmed. I just don't, I don't like him enough to praise him as much because I can't. I would have felt like a phony. There are a lot of people who like him a lot more than I do. And then there were also a lot of novels I wanted. This is straying away from that question a little bit, but there are also some novels that I wanted to include, and I just didn't have room. But one that comes, well, there are a lot of 18th century novels that come to mind, but I didn't think it would be wise to have more than 2 18th century novels on this list. But I really wanted to include American Pastoral by Philip Roth because it's a great novel. Kind of universally recognized as such. I know, but it's also a novel about the dangers of radicalism and how radicalism can tear apart a family, can tear apart a life, and in a pretty modern American context. I ultimately didn't include that novel because I already had a couple of novels that hit on very similar things. I probably could have written about 13 novels that were just about that theme, but I wanted to have more variety, less repetition with what issues were covered. So that's why I didn't include that Roth novel.
Yeah, and I was I'm a big Cormac McCarthy fan, but it's I don't necessarily recommend him because you got to be psychologically ready for
exactly.
books.
No, I thought I especially didn't want to include both him and Naipaul.
Right.
That just would have been too dark. I wanted, that's another thing I was trying to go for in this book is have a variety of tones. So we haven't talked about Evelyn Waugh's Scoop, which I include here. Scoop is a hilarious novel. But I didn't want to include a bunch of satires, even though there are a lot of great conservative satires. But I think, Scoop is one of the funniest novels ever written. And I think it's a great send up of journalism that even journalists recognize as being perfect.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris, for joining us, and thank you to our listeners. And thank you to our sponsors, the Russell Kirk Center for Cultural Renewal. Please visit kirkcenter.org to learn more about the Kirk Center.